There are hundreds, if not thousands of units in Total War Warhammer 3, and knowing how to use every single one of them is the key to mastering a faction in battle. Now this might sound like a monumental task, but what if I told you it was actually pretty simple and can be explained in just a single short video? And if you haven't gathered already, this is that video, so strap yourself in because this is going to get speedy. Now, am I going to go through every single unit and explain them one by one? No, of course not. I do learn the factions anyway, and it would take about a week to even list every single unit. Instead, I'm going to split units into groups, since most fit into a specific role, and all in that group can pretty much be used the exact same for their tier of where you are in the game. First of all, let's get into melee infantry. Our first group is line holders, and these are the most simple. These are the units who are there to keep enemies still and keep themselves alive rather than focusing on doing any damage of their own. They may not rack up the most kills in battle, but they will set up the rest of your army to do so with no problems. Examples of units in this group are things like Dwarf Warriors, most Spear units, and Chaos Warriors. To know if a unit is in this group, you want to take a look at their defense, armor, and leadership stats. If these are particularly high for that stage of the game, then chances are they're a line holder and will do great in that role. This group of units is strong versus most front lines, as they can hold almost anything back, infantry or monsters. They're weak versus fast armies that can outmaneuver them, as their toughness normally makes them quite slow. If enemies get around them and take out your damage, then it's no good having a tough low damage front line with nothing supporting them. Our next frontline group is damage dealers. This second group is fairly similar, but also the opposite. These will still meet enemy lines head on, but instead of waiting for support from other units to do all the damage, they instead want to do a ton of it themselves, at the cost of being a little less survivable. These can pretty much be used the same as line holders, but just expect them to take more damage whilst in battle. Units in this group are Bloodletters of Khorne, Swordmasters of Hoeth, and Black Orcs. Look out for units with high attack and damage to know if they're in this category. This group is strong versus lower tier front lines, as it allows them to cut straight through with minimal risk to themselves. Versus other high damage front lines, they'll struggle a little bit more, since it'll come down to who does the most damage the fastest, since no one is focusing on defending. And our final melee infantry group is a bit of a niche one, and it's the flankers. These are the melee troops that are made for getting around enemy lines and attacking from the backs and sides of enemies, alongside having a front line to hold them in place. Examples of this unit type are Nasty Skulkers, Cairn Wraiths, and Demonettes of Slaanesh. Units in this group generally have high speed, damage, sometimes charge bonus, and even sometimes stealth. They are a very niche unit and want to sneak around the backs of enemies using high speed and wipe them out as fast as possible to open up the rest of the army. Generally, if you have strong cav, you don't really need to use them this way, but they can be fun to spice things up, and often a lot cheaper than cavalry. This group is strong versus armies with no cav of their own, as it allows them to get flanks off with minimal risk to themselves. Next comes to the ranged infantry. Our first group is what I like to call Set and Forget. These are the ranged units you can have sat behind your front lines, and as long as they have a unit they can fire on, you can pretty much just ignore them. As long as you keep them safe from being flanked, they don't really need much instruction other than picking out key targets for them to focus on. Some examples of units like these are Crossbowmen, Sisters of Avalon, and Pink Horrors of Siege. Units in this group always have a steep firing arc. This means their projectiles travel in a curve, not a straight line, allowing them to fire over units' heads. They also often have a large range and ammo pool to keep up the pressure over the course of the entire battle. This group work best versus slower armies, so there's less chance of them being flanked. They also prefer lower armor targets, as generally they have less armor piercing damage due to the slower projectile speed. There are of course certain very balanced exceptions to this rule, but in general, this is the way. Our next group is Line of Sight. Not sure what else to call this one because that is literally all it is. These are units that fire in a straight line, so need a clear line of sight between them and their targets to fire. Units in this group are things like Handgunners, Deck Gunners, and Thunderers. They typically have higher armor piercing than the previous group, but require a clear line of sight with their flat firing arc, as we just said. This means they need to be moved onto the flanks of enemies to hit their front lines once they clash, so they aren't quite as straightforward or risk-free. Their potential damage output is higher, but getting them into position to deal that damage can be a challenge, so they're a higher risk for a higher reward. This group is strong versus armored units and high HP targets, as that generally allows them to make the most of their high damage. They're weak versus fast units, as they can easily catch them out of position and shut them down before they can even fire a shot. And our final ranged unit group is the Skirmishers. These are the units you want to keep on the move whilst firing to keep themselves safe whilst dealing sustained damage to their targets. Generally, you'll be turning on skirmish mode and sending them around the front lines to fire into enemy backs whilst keeping themselves alive. Units in this group are things like Weight Watchers, Corsair Handbows, and Gutter Runners. They normally have a lower range than other ranged units, but it's in a circle shape rather than a cone, so they can fire in any direction rather than just in front of them. They also have higher speed, and the most important part, the ability to fire whilst moving. All of this comes together to make them very hard to pin down, allowing them to deal constant damage to anything in their range whilst always being on the move. They're strong versus comps with no super fast units like cavalry or monsters, as if nothing can catch up to them, they can pretty much keep this up for the entire battle. Now come to the cavalry and chariots. First up we have the sustained combat cavalry. These are one of the two groups that melee cav fall into, and if you're not the best at micromanagement, then these are the pick for you. These are the cav that you can send into combat versus your targets and leave them there knowing they'll take them out with minimal damage to themselves. Think of them as fast moving damage dealer infantry. Units in this class are Chaos Knights, Warbear Riders, and Grail Guardians. They generally have higher melee attack and defense and lower charge bonus. You can also identify them by what weapon their rider carries. If it's a lance or anything else super long that comes down when they charge, normally they're not in this class. Anything else, and most of the time, it's these guys. This group is strong versus armies that have backlines with terrible melee stats, as they can charge in and take them out in combat without having to worry about any damage coming back at them. Versus front lines, especially more elite ones, they tend to struggle, but as long as they work with your melee troops, they should do just about okay. Next up we have Shock Cavalry. These are the much more micro-intensive cav units, and while they require more work, in general their damage potential is much higher if you use them at peak efficiency. When using this group of units, you want to be using the hammer and anvil, which essentially means this. The cav are the hammer, your front lines are the anvil. Once front lines clash, use the hammer to beat the shit out of enemies caught between them and the anvil by charging them in and out constantly to make the most of charge bonus. If you don't know what charge bonus does, I actually have a video that covers all the stats in Total War Warhammer, so click that in that top right corner. Units in this group are Grail Knights, Griffin Legion, and Chaos Knights with Lancers. Units in this group have a much higher charge bonus while sacrificing melee stats, making them devastating on impact, but much weaker and less protected when sat in combat. Remember what we mentioned with weapons in the last group? If they have Lancers or anything else super long, they're probably Shock Cav. This group is strong versus slower enemies that can't move out of the charge. Just be aware of slow enemies with thick lines like zombies, as they can bog you down if you aren't careful and leave them open to being caught out. Next up we have Skirmish, and these are essentially the same as the ranged infantry version, but now they have mounts, so in general can move faster. You want to stick them on Skirmish, get them around the enemy lines and fire into them unprotected whilst keeping themselves safe. Units in this group are things like Pistoliers, Horse Archers, and Glade Riders. They normally have high speed, and of course ranged attacks they can fire in any direction whilst on the move. The same as the ranged infantry counterpart, they do well versus slower enemies that can't catch up to them, and can only be stopped by being shot themselves or caught out by something. As long as you keep them on the move, they can keep up the assaults pretty much the entire battle. And finally, we have Chariots. Chariots are in a group all of their own, and it's for good reason. Nothing else really performs the same as them. In general, they want to be used similar to Shock Cavalry, but with even more micromanagement. They need to be kept on the move at all times, moving in and out of enemy units to make the most of their charge bonus. Where Chariots differ from Shock Cavalry is the impact. Shock Cav hit the units and pretty much come to a stop, transferring all that energy onto their target. Chariots go straight through, so you need to plan their route a lot more carefully to ensure they can get out from whatever you get them into. Units in this group are pretty much all the chariot units, since most of them perform the same job. Even some of the ranged ones also have this charging capability, so just be sure to look at their stats. Speaking of which, they all have extremely high charge bonus, but pitifully low melee defense, hence the need to charge them at all times to avoid any damage. Chariots can be strong versus most enemies, with the only real exception being units with very high mass. These will stop their charges and get them bogged down in the middle of enemies, often resulting in a swift death. Choose your targets and angle of attack carefully to ensure you can always escape, and they will do a lot of work for you, but you have to put just as much work into them. Next up, Beasts and Monsters. First, we have the Flankers. These are the fastest units on the monster roster and can get around enemy lines to take out ranged units with ease, whilst leaving front lines for something a little bit more beefy. They function much the same as Sustained Combat Cav, since you can normally send them in and leave them there till the job is finished. Units in this group are things like Warhounds, Fellbats, and War Lions. Normally, they have quite high entity counts, extremely high speed, and lower end damage or armor. They're of course super strong versus weaker backlines they can take out quickly to dismantle an enemy's damage dealers in moments. Anything that can fight back will give you trouble, since their defense stats are generally on the lower side, so you want to make sure to choose targets and send these units in to outnumber targets when needed. Our next group are front lines, and these are pretty much all of the monsters bar a few very special exceptions. They want to get themselves into the front lines alongside your infantry to bring a ton of weight and damage, whilst avoiding taking too much damage by going in alone. Units in this group are things like Trolls, Dragon Ogre Shagoths, and Vargulfs. They typically have high damage, very large area attacks, and high attack stats. This makes them great versus pretty much any front line as long as they have support. Sending them in alone will result in the large hitboxes taking more hits, and them losing a ton of HP very quickly, also down to the fact that generally because they're monsters and they are so large and aggressive, they don't have the best defensive stats. With infantry, that damage is spread out, allowing them to rip and tear at a much lower risk of themselves. Some units like Dragon Ogres can technically do both of these jobs, so if you spot a unit with high melee stats and speed, then this is one of them, but in general, it's one or the other. Next we have Artillery, and there is only one group, but I thought I'd mention them anyway since this video is aiming to cover how to use every unit in the game, and Artillery are units in the game. Artillery normally only has one strategy of set forget, similar to the ranged infantry. You just set up your piece at the back of the army and have them fire on whatever you like as the enemy gets closer. There are many kinds of damage and firing arcs, so choose tags to make the most of them, but in general, leave them at the back and firing the entire battle and they should do great. Units in this group are things like cannons, Hellstorm rocket batteries, and Doomdiver catapults. They have massive range and missile strength, but low stats basically everywhere else. They're great versus a variety of enemies depending on their damage, be it massive clumps with thousands of entities, or single targets with beefy HP bars. In general, they're weak to being flanked as they can't defend themselves against a gentle breeze, so keep them safe from this and they should do fine. There are a couple of artillery units that can both fire over a massive range and do some work in melee. The most notable examples are the Skull Cannon, which can also function like a chariot, and the Cygor, which is a giant monster that can also lob huge rocks across the map. These are a little bit too rare to have their own group, but just know that they do exist. If a unit has a huge range and missile strength, but also has other stats that are pretty good, it's one of these, and most of the time is a great pick for pretty much any army. And finally, we come to the Lords of Heroes. Of course, we can't do all this without mentioning the leaders of these armies, because they come in a few flavors too. Now, some Lords and Heroes fit into the same groups as other units like Skirmishers, Shock, and Sustained Combat Cav, but some are quite unique, so we'll quickly cover those. First up, we have the Frontlines Experts. These are the lords that want to be in the front lines alongside your infantry and monsters, both dealing damage and keeping your troops encouraged just by their presence. These are lords like Kolek, Skarbrand, and Grimgor Ironhide. Generally, they are unmounted, have very high melee stats and damage, as well as decent toughness to survive literally being on the front lines of combat. They're good all-round lords, but their lack of mounts means they don't have a lot of speed and can fail to keep up with the action. Especially if they're a larger size, it can also make them an easier target for ranged units if they can't run out of sight or towards the attacker. Also, as stupid as it sounds, but having a large area attack can sometimes mean they continuously miss their targets if they're one-on-one in a duel, and that's where duelists come in. These are very similar to Frontlines Experts, but are just a little bit more specialised for one-on-one engagements. Examples of these are Loki, Banshees, and generally pretty much all assassin heroes. These units have very high melee stats, both attack and defense, as well as high damage, particularly armor piercing. This makes them better suited to taking on single entity targets one-on-one, as their damage will go straight to 1 HP bar, as well as them having a great hit rate and defense chance. They can also do the same job as Frontlines Experts most of the time, but if you can find them a single target, they'll do way better for you. And finally, we have Spellcasters, and I think everyone knows how to use Spellcasters, but let's say it anyway. A Spellcaster wants to sit in a safe spot and use all of their spells as constantly as they can, and that's pretty much it. They want to avoid all combat and keep themselves alive at all costs to keep the support coming. Examples of these units are Empire Wizards, Mages, and Lich Priests, pretty much all heroes that are spellcasters with a very few exceptions. All you're looking for these guys is a spellbook and terrible melee stats and damage. If they can fight, then this isn't them, and they kind of take on a hybrid role with the Frontlines Experts. Pure spellcasters need to play like cowards because they have true glass cannons that can bring a lot of value as long as you can keep them safe. And that's pretty much how to use every unit in Total War Warhammer 3. Like I said, nearly every unit in the game fits into one of these groups, so hopefully from the descriptions you can work it out. But if you can't, drop by the Discord to ask. We've got a great community to help you out with pretty much anything, so feel free to stop by. If you enjoyed this video and or found it useful, consider dropping a like and subscribe to see more content. Hoping to have a great 2023, so I'd love to have you along for the ride. If you really enjoy the content and want to support it directly, then consider becoming a member on YouTube or a patron on the Patreon. Doing so gets you early insights into future content, increased voting power, discounts on merch, as well as shoutouts at the end of videos like Henry took with his sport at the Officer State. A thank you to all supporters. One last thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.